In the sun-baked hills of Texas, 6 cartel thugs are about to learn why some legends never die. When they surrounded 90-year-old Daniel Cooper outside his ranch house, kicking away his crutches and laughing, they thought they were dealing with just another helpless old man. They couldn't have been more wrong. Before his hands started shaking and his legs needed support, Daniel Ghost Eye Cooper was the deadliest sniper in Marine Corps history, with 317 confirmed kills in Korea. The man they're mocking hasn't missed. A target in 60 years, arthritis or not. Now, as these young criminals circle what they think is easy prey, they don't realize they're standing in the pre-marked firing positions of a man who once eliminated an entire enemy platoon without moving from his hide. This isn't just another story about picking on the elderly. This is about how the most vicious cartel in Texas learned that old Marines don't lose their bite. They just get more patient. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Texas hills in shades of amber and gold as Daniel Cooper made his morning rounds. His weathered hands gripped aluminum crutches, but his movements held a deliberate grace that belied his 90 years. The ranch had been his home. For 6 decades, every fence post and cattle track as familiar as the scars on his hands. From his front porch, he could see 3 miles in any direction. Old habits that had kept him alive through 2 wars, still serving him well. The property wasn't much by Texas standards, just 500 acres of tough grassland and limestone ridges. But it was his. More importantly, it was strategically perfect, though none of his neighbors would understand why he thought about land. "That way! Grandpa!" Sarah's voice carried across the morning air as her pickup kicked up dust on the approach road. His granddaughter, 28 and fierce as a summer storm, had her grandmother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness. She'd been helping with the ranch since she could walk, and now, with his legs not what they used to be, her help had become essential. "You're early!" Daniel called out, his voice still parade ground clear despite his age. Sarah jumped down from her truck, medical bag in hand. Her job as a local nurse practitioner meant she could check on him daily under the guise of her rounds. "Thought I'd catch you before you started your morning walk," she said, making air quotes. They both knew his morning routine wasn't just about checking fences. Every day, without fail, he would make his way to the old barn, where his private shooting range waited. Inside the ranch house, everything had its place. Photographs on the walls told a story few would believe. A young Marine in Korea. Citations and medals carefully framed but not prominently displayed. And more recent pictures of shooting competition victories well into his 80s. "Blood pressure first," Sarah insisted, pulling out her equipment. Daniel submitted to her ministrations with military patience. "You know, most 90-year-olds aren't up at dawn patrolling their property. Most 90-year-olds haven't had my training," Daniel replied, a slight smile creasing his weathered face. His eyes, still sharp as a hawk's, tracked movement on the distant highway. 3 black SUVs passed by yesterday. Same ones came back this morning. Sarah's hands paused on her equipment. "Cartel?" The word carried weight in these parts. The border was too close, and too many quiet ranches had changed hands lately. Probably. Daniel's voice held no fear, just tactical assessment. "They've been buying up properties along the valley. Some sales more voluntary than others." Sarah's face tightened with worry. "Maybe it's time to consider that retirement community in Austin. The one with the nice golf course?" Daniel's laugh was dry as prairie grass. "Honey, I retired once, didn't take." He gestured to the land around them. "This ranch isn't just a farm. Every ridge, every draw, every approach, I chose this place. For a reason. Because you're stubborn as a mule? Because it's defendable." The old Marine's voice turned serious. "Your grandmother understood. It's why she agreed to buy it back in '63. Perfect fields of fire, natural choke points, high ground advantage, Sarah sighed, packing away her medical equipment. His blood pressure was perfect, as always. Most people don't shop for ranches based on their tactical advantages, Grandpa. Most people didn't spend 20 years looking through a scope at people who wanted them dead. He patted her hand. Don't worry about me, little one. Worry about anyone stupid enough to think old means helpless. As Sarah drove off to start her rounds, Daniel made his way to the barn with measured steps. Inside, past the normal ranch equipment, a hidden door led to his private range. Here, every morning for 60 years, he maintained the skills that had once made him a legend. The rifle was old, like him, but meticulously maintained. His hands might shake holding a coffee cup, but when they touched the familiar wood and steel, they became rock steady. Downrange, targets waited at precisely marked distances. He hadn't missed a morning practice in 60 years, and he wasn't about to start now. The first shot broke the morning silence. In the distance, a target jumped, still center mass, still perfect. Some things once learned never leave you, like the patience to wait for the perfect shot or the wisdom to know when trouble was coming. Those black SUVs would be back. Daniel Cooper loaded another round, his movements smooth and practiced. Let them come. They'd learn what every enemy he'd ever faced had learned. Sometimes the deadliest predators are the ones that look the weakest. The old footlocker hadn't been opened in years, but Daniel Cooper knew every item inside by heart. Sitting in his study, late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, he ran his fingers over the worn Marine Corps emblem on the lid. Inside lay the memories of a life most wouldn't believe. Ghost Eye Cooper, they'd called him in Korea, not for his stealth, though he had that in spades, but for his uncanny ability to see and hit targets others swore were impossible. 317 confirmed kills, though the real number was higher. Some shots were never officially recorded, especially those deep behind enemy lines. He lifted out a faded photograph, 23 young Marines, class of 51 sniper school. He was the only one still alive. Below it lay his distinguished service. Cross, awarded after the Battle of Chaussin Reservoir. For 3 days he'd held a ridge alone, protecting the withdrawal of his entire battalion. 92 confirmed kills in 72 hours. They said it was impossible. They said the cold alone should have killed him. The cold was your friend, he murmured, remembering the lessons he'd taught later as an instructor. It slows them down, makes them predictable. Patient hunter always wins. Sarah found him there, lost in memories. She'd never seen the footlocker open before. Grandpa, Daniel held up a weathered leather-bound journal. Your grandmother made me keep this. Said, someone should know the truth. He opened it carefully, revealing detailed hand-drawn maps and observation notes. December 13th, 1950. Temperature -40, wind from the northwest at 8 knots, enemy column approaching through valley at dawn. Sarah sat beside him, carefully touching the yellowed pages. You never talk about Korea. Most of it's not worth talking about. Cold, fear, death. He turned a page. But some things need to be remembered. Lessons paid for in blood. He showed her a map, carefully drawn. See these markings? Range cards. Every sniper makes them. Shows. Distances, wind calls, hiding spots. Been doing the same thing here on the ranch. Every fence post, every tree, every ridge. I know the exact distance. That's why you chose this place. Sarah realized you've been preparing for something like this your whole life. Daniel nodded. Your grandmother understood. She was a nurse. In Korea, met her after Chosin. She patched me up, saw what I could do, never flinched from it. He pulled out another photo. Himself and a beautiful young nurse, both in uniform. Margaret knew what I was. Said God made men like me for a reason, not to glory in the killing, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The leg injury came later, in '69. Not in Vietnam, He'd been too valuable as an instructor by then, but in a training accident. Shattered his knee, ended his active career. But it hadn't ended his vigilance. That's when we bought the ranch, he continued. Perfect setup, high ground, clear lines of sight. Lots of old-timers bought land back then. Some of us, we chose carefully. Sarah picked up a medal she didn't recognize. What's this one for? That's not official. Special Operation 67. Trained some boys who needed particular skills. Can't say more than that. His eyes grew distant, but they remembered. Still get Christmas cards from a few. Coded, of course. Old habits. The sun was setting now, painting. The study in shades of red. Daniel carefully repacked the footlocker, each item in its place, but he kept out one photo, himself at 85, holding a trophy from the National Long-Range Shooting Championships. They thought I was too old then, he said softly. Same way these cartel boys think I'm too old now. Being underestimated, that's always been my best weapon. Sarah helped him stand, noting how he checked the windows automatically, scanning. The horizon. You've been watching them, haven't you? The cartel. Been watching everything, little one. That's what snipers do. We watch, we wait, we choose the perfect moment. He patted the footlocker. Everything I learned back then, I learned it for now. Sometimes the past isn't just memories, sometimes it's preparation. Outside, the Texas sun slipped behind the hills. In the distance, dust rose from the highway, more black SUVs making their presence known. Daniel Cooper watched them through. His window, his sniper's eyes measuring distance, noting patterns. Your grandmother always said God had a purpose for everyone, he told Sarah. Maybe this is mine. Maybe all those years, all those shots were just practice for what's coming. Sarah squeezed his hand, finally understanding why her grandfather had never really retired. Some skills you don't let fade, some duties don't end, and some old soldiers don't need legs that work perfectly to be deadly. The black SUVs appeared at precisely 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Daniel had been expecting them. 3 vehicles, too clean for ranch country, moving with the kind of purpose that meant business. He watched them through his kitchen window, noting details out of pure habit. 7 men total, professional postures, concealed weapons printing under expensive jackets. Right on schedule, he murmured to himself, checking the distance to the nearest pre-marked fence post. 217 yards exactly. Some old habits never die. They parked in a practiced formation, 1 vehicle ahead, 2 blocking potential escape routes. Standard intimidation tactics, though they probably thought they were being subtle. Daniel took his time gathering his crutches, letting them wait in the Texas heat. Through the window he saw them checking their phones, trying to look casual. While studying the property, the leader stepped out first, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Daniel had seen that smile before, on men who gave orders but let others do the killing. 2 guards flanked him, trying too hard to look like ordinary businessmen. Mr. Cooper? The leader's voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of border. Accent. I'm Miguel Ramirez. Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. Daniel opened his screen door slowly, positioning himself carefully on his porch. Every movement was measured, deliberate. Let them see the old man with crutches. Let them underestimate. Mighty fancy cars for ranch business, Daniel observed. Mildly, noting how the guards' hands stayed close to their jackets, Ramirez's smile widened. We represent an investment group. Been buying properties in the area. Heard you might be interested in selling. Heard wrong. Daniel's voice was friendly but firm. Ranch isn't for sale. Perhaps we should discuss numbers before making decisions. Ramirez pulled out a leather folder. We're prepared to offer significantly above market value, $3 million cash, more than generous for a property this size. Daniel didn't even glance at the folder. His eyes were busy marking positions, noting sight lines, calculating ranges to every piece of cover on his property. The guards were spreading out slightly, unconsciously moving to tactical positions. Ex-military, probably. Their movement patterns were too practiced. Money's not everything, Mr. Ramirez. Land's been in my family too long. Ramirez's smile slipped just slightly. One of his men whispered something in Spanish, a comment about the old man's stubbornness. Daniel pretended not to understand, though he'd learned more Spanish in Korea than any of them would guess. Mr. Cooper, let me be direct. Ramirez stepped closer, his tone dropping. The valley is changing. Progress, you might say. You can be part of that change and profit from it, or... Daniel's voice remained mild, but his eyes had turned hard as rifle steel. Or you might find ranch life becoming very difficult. Accidents happen, especially to elderly men living alone. Roads can be dangerous. Houses catch fire. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his grip on his crutches. The movement drew their eyes exactly where he wanted, to his apparent weakness. Meanwhile, his sniper's gaze had already mapped every man's position, noted every weapon, calculated every angle. Sounds like a threat, Mr. Ramirez. Simply stating facts. 3 million is generous now. Next week? Who knows? Ramirez placed his card on the porch railing. 24 hours to decide. I suggest you think carefully. About your situation. Man your age, living alone, wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen. As they turned to leave, one of the guards deliberately bumped Daniel's crutch, making him stumble slightly. They laughed among themselves, enjoying the show of power. They never saw how smoothly he recovered, never noticed how his stumble gave him a perfect count of their weapons. Real shame, the guard said in Spanish, loud enough to hear, when the old ones don't know when to give up. Daniel watched their departure through narrowed eyes, noting their route, memorizing license plates. Only when they were gone did he allow himself a small, grim smile. They thought they'd seen a vulnerable old man. What they'd actually seen was a combat veteran conducting reconnaissance. Inside, he made his way to the barn where his rifle waited. Time for some practice. After all, he had some new ranges to confirm. As he worked the bolt action smoothly, muscle memory from thousands of repetitions taking over, he reflected on Ramirez's threat. They'd be back, probably at night next time, trying to scare him, maybe burn him out. Standard cartel tactics, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. They saw an old man with crutches. They should have looked closer. Should have. Wondered why a 90-year-old's eyes were still sharp enough to catch the light reflecting off their hidden weapons. 24 hours, Daniel murmured, settling into his shooting position. His first shot hit dead center at 400 yards. Perfect as always. Should be just enough time to get ready for their next visit. Sarah Cooper knew something was wrong the moment she turned onto Old Mill Road. The Henderson place, normally bustling with activity, sat eerily quiet. No trucks in the driveway, no cattle in the front pasture, no smoke from the chimney despite the morning chill. They left last night, her grandfather said from the passenger seat. She'd insisted on driving him to his doctor's appointment, though they both knew his health wasn't the real reason for her visit. Packed up and disappeared, just like the Wilsons last week. Did they say anything to you? Daniel's weathered face remained impassive. Didn't have to. Saw the burn marks on their barn, same kind of accident that happened to Matthews before he sold. The valley was changing, just as Ramirez had promised. In the past month, 3 ranches had changed hands. Each sale followed the same pattern. Mysterious problems, escalating accidents, then a quick, quiet transaction with cash buyers nobody ever seemed to meet. At the local diner, where they stopped for lunch after the appointment, the tension was palpable. Conversations dropped to whispers when strangers entered. Long-time ranchers sat in corners, discussing property values and insurance rates in low voices. Cooper, Sheriff Mike Hayes, approached their table, coffee in hand. He looked tired, older than his 50 years. Hear you had some visitors yesterday. Just some businessmen, Daniel replied mildly. Interested in the property? Same one's been visiting everyone else? The sheriff's question carried weight. They both knew local law enforcement was overwhelmed, understaffed, and outgunned. Probably. Daniel's voice gave nothing away. Made them the same answer everyone should have made. No sale. Hayes rubbed his face. Daniel, I've known you 30 years. I know what you can do. But these people, they're different. They don't play by rules. Neither did the Chinese at Chosen. Daniel's quiet words made the sheriff blink. Rules are for people who fear consequences. Mike, some folks need reminding that consequences still exist. After lunch, Sarah drove them back to the ranch. She noticed her grandfather watching the hills, his eyes constantly moving, checking distances. The old sniper was building mental maps, just as he'd done in Korea. They hit the Martinez place last night, she told him, sharing the latest community gossip. Cut their fence lines, scattered their cattle. Jose's talking about selling. Predictable. Pattern, Daniel observed. Start small, property damage, missing animals. Escalate slowly until the target feels helpless. Standard insurgency tactics, just aimed at civilians. At the ranch, Daniel insisted on checking his fence line. Sarah walked beside him, watching him mark locations in a small notebook. Each pause, each note was precise, methodical. What are you planning, Grandpa? Planning. His smile was subtle. Just making sure my property's secure. Man my age has to be careful, you know. But Sarah saw more than just property maintenance. She noticed the new motion sensors disguised as garden lights, the carefully trimmed shooting lanes masked as routine brush clearing. Her grandfather wasn't just maintaining his ranch, he was preparing a battlefield. Back at the house, Daniel received 3 calls from neighbors. Each conversation was brief, coded in the way old ranchers had of talking around sensitive subjects. After each call, he made more notes in his book. Thompson's selling, he reported after the last call. They broke his brother's arm last night, said it was a car accident. Shouldn't we call the FBI? Surely there's something already tried. Daniel's voice was grim. Local office is investigating, means they're either bought or scared. Same thing in the end. As evening approached, Sarah prepared to leave. She worried about leaving him alone, but her grandfather seemed calmer than she'd seen him in years. There was purpose in his movements now, the same focused energy she'd seen in old photos of him in uniform. Got my radio if you need me, she reminded him. I can be here in 15 minutes. I'll be fine. He patted her hand. Just going to do some evening shooting practice. Got to stay sharp at my age. Sarah drove home slowly, watching dust trails. On distant roads, more black SUVs moving through the valley, more old ranches going quiet. But her grandfather's ranch stood like a fortress on its hill, watched over by eyes that had once held off an army. The warning signs were clear to anyone who knew how to read them. The cartel was tightening its grip on the valley, squeezing out those who refused to sell. They thought Daniel Cooper would be the easiest target, just another old man living alone. Sarah almost felt sorry for them. Almost. They were about to learn what her grandmother had always said. Sometimes God leaves. Old warriors around for a reason. The first accident happened on a Wednesday. Daniel's cattle broke through a fence that had been suspiciously cut, scattering across 3 properties. As he surveyed the damage, leaning on his crutches, he noted tire tracks that weren't from any local vehicles, 2 distinct patterns, heavy SUVs and lighter scout vehicles. Getting sloppy, he muttered, measuring the depth of the tracks. Overconfident. Sheriff Hayes arrived an hour later, going through the motions of taking a report everyone knew would lead nowhere. 3rd incident this week, he said, not meeting Daniel's eyes. Martinez lost 30 head yesterday. Wilson's well got contaminated. Patterns escalating, Daniel observed, his sniper's mind analyzing their tactics. They're getting impatient. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, I got a call from the county commissioner. They're suggesting I encourage you to consider that offer. Say it would be better for everyone. Better for everyone, except the folks who'd have to live with knowing they gave in to thugs. Daniel's voice carried the same steel it had in Korea. You tell that commissioner my land's not for sale, at any price. That night, Daniel heard vehicles on the access road. Through his night vision scope, he watched 3 men tampering with his south gate. He could have ended it there. 3 perfect shots in the darkness. But patience had always been his greatest weapon. Instead, he documented everything. Vehicle descriptions, faces caught in infrared, patterns of movement. Each detail added to his growing intelligence file. Let them think their intimidation was working. Let them grow bolder. Sarah arrived at dawn, finding him already awake and alert. They hit the Martinez place again, she reported. Jose's talking. About selling, says his kids are getting threats at school. Daniel nodded grimly. They're isolating targets. Pressure the weak points first, create a domino effect. He showed her his notebook. 7 properties sold in 3 weeks. Each one strategic, cutting off access roads, controlling water rights. Grandpa, they burned down the Wilsons' barn last night. While they were sleeping, Sarah's voice cracked. This isn't just business anymore. They're going to kill someone. That's always been their plan. Daniel checked his morning coffee, a habit from years of watching men die from poisoned water. Sources. Violence is just their punctuation mark. Fear is their real weapon. Through his window, he watched dust trails on the highway. More black SUVs, moving with the arrogant confidence of predators who'd found easy prey. But they'd made a crucial mistake. One he'd seen enemies make before. They think fear only works one way, he explained to Sarah. Think if they frighten enough people, break enough things, everyone will fall in line. Never occurs to them that some folks spend their whole lives preparing to stand against exactly this kind of evil. A truck pulled up, Thompson from the next ranch over. His arm was in a cast, his face drawn with worry. They're saying you're next, Cooper. Say they're going to make an example. Daniel's smile was cold as Korean winter. Let them try. That afternoon, more incidents piled up. Someone poisoned Old Man Johnson's cattle. The Ramirez family's trucks all had their brake lines cut. Each attack calculated, each one sending the same message. Resistance was futile. But in his barn, Daniel Cooper was sending messages of his own. Each practice shot, fired at carefully measured ranges, told a different story. The story of a man who'd once held off an army, who'd taught generations of snipers, who understood that true strength isn't in causing fear, but in standing against it. Getting predictable, he noted in his book, marking their patrol patterns. 2 vehicles every 4 hours, same routes, same arrogant assumption that an old man with crutches couldn't be a threat. Their overconfidence was writing checks their skills couldn't cash. As darkness fell, Sarah made one last attempt to reason with him. The Hendersons are leaving tonight, said to tell you there's still time to take the offer. Daniel checked his rifle one last time, each movement precise despite his aged hands. Time's the one thing I've got plenty of, little one. Time and patience, 2 things these boys are about to run out of. Through his scope, he watched more cartel vehicles moving through his valley. Let them come. Let them think their pressure was working. They'd learn soon enough why some old soldiers don't need strong legs to be deadly. The pressure was mounting, just as they planned. But pressure works both ways. Sometimes it crushes, and sometimes, in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, it becomes a weapon all its own. They came at sunset, timing their arrival with the blinding western light. 6 men, moving with the casual cruelty of predators who'd never met real resistance. Daniel Cooper watched them approach his porch, noting their tactical mistakes even as they thought they were being clever. Last chance, old man, the leader called out. Not Ramirez this time, but one of his enforcers. Younger, cockier, more prone to violence. They were escalating, just as Daniel had predicted. Boss says you're either selling or burning. Your choice. Daniel stood on his porch, leaning on his crutches, deliberately playing up his frailty. Mighty brave of you boys, he observed mildly. 6 against one old cripple. The leader, Marco, Daniel had learned from his intelligence gathering, grinned nastily. "Oh, we're just here to talk, for now." He mounted the porch steps while his men spread out in what they thought was an intimidating pattern. Though accidents happen, especially to stubborn old men who can't even walk right. "That's a fact," Daniel agreed, his sniper's eyes marking each man's position. 2 on his left, 3 on his right. Marco in front. Perfect spacing for what was coming. Accidents do happen. Like this accident? Marco suddenly kicked out, sharp and vicious, knocking one of Daniel's crutches away. His men laughed as the old rancher stumbled, grabbing the porch railing for support. "Whoops," Marco sneered. "Better be careful there, abuelo. Long way to fall at your age." Daniel allowed himself to look afraid, letting them see what they expected, a vulnerable old man at their mercy. "Now, boys," he said, voice quavering slightly, "no need for trouble." "Trouble?" Marco kicked away the second crutch, leaving Daniel clinging to the railing. "Trouble is being stupid. Trouble is not knowing when you're beaten like this." He reached for Daniel's collar, intending to shake him like a disobedient child. That's when everything changed. Daniel's hand shot out with snake-like speed, grabbing Marco's wrist in a grip that felt like steel cables. Before anyone could react, he twisted, using Marco's own momentum to send him sprawling. The movement was fluid, practiced, the motion of a man who'd spent decades training for exactly this moment. "What the f—" One of the men reached for his weapon, but Daniel was already moving. The frail old man vanished, replaced by something else entirely. His first strike crushed the nearest thug's throat. The second dislocated another's knee with surgical precision. Jesus Christ! The remaining men scrambled for their guns, but they were too close, too bunched together. Daniel's movements were economical, brutal. Close combat techniques learned in Korea and perfected over 60 years. The fourth man got his weapon halfway out before Daniel's elbow strike shattered his jaw. The fifth managed to fire, but his panic made him shoot wide. Daniel's counterattack left him unconscious beside his friends. The last man standing turned to run, finally understanding what they'd awakened. Daniel let him take 2 steps before sweeping his legs out from under him. The impact drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping on the porch boards. Marco, still conscious, stared up at Daniel with dawning horror. The old man stood over them, no sign of frailty in his stance, despite his bad leg. His eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a predator who just sprung his trap. 30 seconds, Daniel announced calmly, checking his watch. That's how long it took me to take down 6 armed men. Not bad for my age. He retrieved one of his crutches, using it to roll Marco onto his back. Want to know my best time? Back in 51, I could do 8 men in 20 seconds, but that was a long time ago. You're insane, Marco gasped. You're dead. When the boss hears— "Oh, I'm counting on that," Daniel interrupted. "I want him to hear exactly what happened. Want him to know that his 6 best men got taken down by an old cripple." He smiled, and there was nothing frail about it. Want him to understand exactly what he's dealing with. Sarah's truck roared up the drive, her arrival precisely timed. She took in the scene, 6 cartel thugs sprawled across her grandfather's porch, without missing a beat. Right on schedule, Daniel noted. "Call the sheriff, would you? Tell him I had some trespassers, made a bit of a mess." As Sarah made the call, Daniel looked down at Marco, who was still staring at him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Word of advice, son. Next time you want to play tough guy, make sure you know who you're dealing with. Some old dog still. Remember their tricks." The setting sun painted the scene in shades of red, a fitting backdrop for the cartel's first real lesson. They'd thought they were hunting easy prey. Instead, they'd just prodded a sleeping lion, and Daniel Cooper was just getting started. The morning after the porch incident, rumors spread through the valley like wildfire. 6 of the cartel's toughest enforcers laid out by a 90-year-old man with a bad leg. Some called it luck, others said it was impossible. But Daniel Cooper was already focused on what came next. "They'll respond with overwhelming force," he explained to Sarah as they walked his property line. His crutches left precise marks in the morning dew, each step carefully measured. "Pride's been hurt. They'll want to make an example." But as they walked, Sarah began to notice things she'd overlooked before. The way certain trees had been trimmed to create clear lines of sight. How the cattle paths naturally channeled movement toward pre-selected points. Even the seemingly random piles of old equipment were carefully positioned to provide cover or force specific approaches. "You've been preparing for this for years," she realized. Daniel nodded, pausing to check a hidden motion sensor disguised as a broken fence post. "Since '63. Your grandmother used to say I was paranoid, setting up fields of fire on a cattle ranch, but she understood. Some skills you don't let rust." They reached the barn, where Daniel unlocked a hidden door. Sarah had never noticed. Inside was a room that made her breath catch. Gun racks held carefully maintained rifles, each one tagged with precise range data. Maps covered the walls, showing overlapping fields of fire and range calculations. One entire wall was dedicated to surveillance photos of cartel movements in the valley. "This is impressive," Sarah managed. "This is preparation." Daniel moved to a workbench where he'd laid out his primary rifle. MPRTA-1, Marine Corps Standard Issue Sniper Rifle, modified for my specific needs. Same model I used in Korea, though this one's newer. Present from some old friends in '82. He began his daily maintenance routine, each movement precise, despite his aged hands. Most folks think sniping is about shooting. It's not. It's about patience, preparation, understanding your enemy's patterns. He showed her his notebooks, decades of observations. Weather patterns, seasonal changes in visibility, how terrain affected movement during different conditions. Every detail that could affect a shot had been meticulously recorded. "Yesterday wasn't luck," he explained, cleaning his rifle with practiced care. "Those men stood exactly where I've been practicing for years. Every board on that porch, every angle, every possible approach. I knew them better than they knew themselves." A truck approached, Sheriff Hayes arriving for his follow-up report. Daniel quickly secured the room, but not before Sarah saw more. Communications equipment, night vision gear, things a rancher shouldn't have. "Your friends in the Corps," she said carefully. "They've been helping you prepare." Daniel's smile was subtle. "Let's just say some debts don't expire. Some old soldiers remember who had their backs." The sheriff's interview was brief. The attackers weren't talking, claiming they'd been jumped by multiple assailants. Nobody believed them, but nobody could explain how one old man with crutches had dismantled 6 trained fighters. "Cartels pulling people in from other territories," Hayes reported grimly. "They're taking this personally now." "Good." Daniel's response surprised them both. "Let them come. Let them commit their forces where I want them." After Hayes left, Daniel returned to the hidden room. Sarah watched him check his equipment with the same methodical precision he'd used in maintaining his ranch for decades. "Those men yesterday," she said slowly, "they didn't just lose a fight, did they? This was all part of your plan. First rule of combat. Let the enemy think they're in control." Daniel adjusted his scope minutely. They thought they were escalating. Really, they were just following a path I'd laid out 30 years ago. Through the barn window, they watched more cartel vehicles moving on distant roads. They were being less subtle now, anger making them sloppy, just as Daniel had predicted. "You're not just defending the ranch," Sarah realized. "You're setting a trap." Daniel chambered around, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Some traps take decades to prepare, little one, but those are always the best kind." The sun climbed higher, illuminating a battlefield only Daniel could fully see. To others, it was just a ranch. To him, it was the culmination of 60 years of preparation. The cartel thought yesterday had been a humiliation. They didn't understand it was just the beginning. Ramirez himself came at noon, bringing enough men to make his intentions clear. 8 vehicles, over 20 armed guards. They lined up along Daniel's fence line like an invading army, which in a way they were. Daniel watched their approach. Through his scope, counting weapons, noting positions. Professional guards this time, not local muscle. They moved with military precision, setting up a proper perimeter. Someone in their organization had finally done their homework. Quite a reception committee, Sarah observed from beside him. She'd refused to leave despite his instructions, showing that Cooper's stubbornness ran deep. They're nervous, Daniel replied, noting their formations. See how they're staying spread out? They learned from yesterday, won't let themselves be bunched. Up again. Ramirez stepped out of his SUV, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in ranch country. His smile was gone, replaced by cold fury barely held in check. 2 guards flanked him, hands on weapons, as he approached the porch. Your reputation, Ramirez called out, was apparently understated, Mr. Cooper. Or should I say Sergeant Cooper. Distinguished Service Cross career, over 300 confirmed kills. Daniel emerged onto his porch, leaning on his crutches. Let them watch him. Let them wonder. Did your homework a bit late, didn't you? An oversight that has been corrected. Ramirez's voice carried the promise of violence. Though I must admit, we're all curious. How does a 90-year-old man take down 6 trained fighters? Same way you take down any bully, Daniel replied calmly. You show them their weakness. Ramirez's face tightened. Those men were following orders, my orders. That makes their humiliation my problem. Way I see it, Daniel shifted slightly, positioning himself exactly where he needed to be. Your problem is thinking threats and violence make you strong. Where I come from, that just makes you a target. A target? Ramirez laughed. But there was no humor in it. Look around you, old man. You're surrounded. Whatever skills you once had, whatever tricks you played yesterday, they won't help you against these odds. Daniel's smile was cold as Korean winter. Son, I once held off an entire Chinese battalion for 3 days. Killed 92 of them. You think 20 cartel thugs worry me? The guards shifted uneasily. They'd been briefed on his history now, and something in his voice made them believe it. That was 70 years ago, Ramirez countered. You're not that man anymore. Want to test that theory? Daniel's voice turned deadly quiet. Your men are standing in pre-marked firing positions. Every distance, every angle, calculated and practiced for decades. Even with my crutches, I can put a round through any man here before he clears his holster. To demonstrate, he nodded toward a distant fence post. That post there? 812 yards. I put 3 rounds through it every morning. Been doing it so long, I don't even need to measure the wind anymore. Ramirez studied him carefully, finally seeing what his men had missed yesterday. The frailty was there, yes, but beneath it was something else, something that had held off armies and trained generations of warriors. You can't win this, Ramirez said finally. Even if you kill some of us, we'll keep coming. We'll burn you out, destroy everything you have. Maybe, Daniel agreed, but I'll take a hell of a lot of you with me, and unlike your men, I'm not afraid to die. Question is, how many are you willing to lose? How many body bags before the price is too high? A tense silence fell. In the distance a hawk circled, its cry carrying across the ranch. Daniel knew Sarah was recording everything from inside, documenting each threat, each movement. You have 1 hour, Ramirez said finally. Take our offer or we do this the hard way. Already chose the hard way in 1950, Daniel replied. Ain't about to change my mind now. As the cartel convoy pulled away, Sarah joined her grandfather on the porch. They'll come at night, she said quietly. Try to overwhelm you with numbers. Daniel nodded, already calculating angles, preparing firing positions. That's what the Chinese did too. Didn't work out too well for them either. He turned to her, his eyes carrying the weight of decades of combat experience. Time for you to go, little one. What's coming next isn't for civilians to see. I'm staying, she said firmly. Someone needs to document what happens. Someone needs to tell the truth. Daniel studied her for a long moment, seeing her grandmother's determination in her stance. Your choice, he said finally, but stay in the basement. Got a feeling tonight's going to get mighty loud. As the sun began its descent, Daniel Cooper made his final preparations. The line had been drawn. Now it was just a matter of waiting to see who would cross it first. Dusk settled over the ranch like a soldier's blanket, familiar and comfortable to Daniel Cooper. In his hidden command center, formerly the barn's hayloft, he made his final preparations. Each movement was deliberate, practiced over thousands of repetitions. They'll come in 3 waves, he explained to Sarah, who was documenting everything with her phone. First wave will be scouts, looking for security systems. Second wave will be their technical team, trying to disable what they find. Main force comes last, thinking they've got a clear path. His workspace looked more military than agricultural. Night vision equipment, communications gear, and carefully maintained weapons surrounded a detailed tactical map of the property. Each approach route was marked with precise distances and elevations. This isn't just a ranch, Sarah realized, watching him check his equipment. It's a kill box. Daniel nodded. Pleased she understood. Every fence is positioned to channel movement. Every gate is a choke point. Even the cattle paths, they look random, but they force anyone trying to move quietly into pre-sighted positions. He showed her his primary firing positions, each one carefully concealed and covering multiple approaches. 3 principles of ranch defense, he said, the instructor in him coming out. First, control their movement. Make them go where you want them. Through his night vision scope, he watched the first cartel vehicles taking position on distant roads, right on schedule. Second, he continued, adjusting his scope minutely, make them think they're in control. Let them believe their plan is working. Sarah noticed small LED lights scattered across the property, seemingly random. Motion sensors. Better. Daniel's smile was wolfish. Infrared markers. They'll use thermal imaging to avoid normal security systems. These will give them false confidence, make them think they've found all my defenses. The first scout team was moving now, 2 men checking the perimeter. They were good, professional infiltrators using proper tactical movement, but they were checking exactly where Daniel wanted them to check. Third principle? Sarah asked, watching the scouts through a spare scope. Make them commit. Daniel's voice carried decades of combat experience. Enemies most vulnerable when they think they're about to win. The scouts found his first set of sensors exactly where he'd wanted them found. Their hand signals showed satisfaction. They thought they'd discovered his security perimeter. They'll report back, Daniel narrated, tracking their movement. Tell their leaders they've found my defensive line. Won't realize it's just the first layer. In the growing darkness, more vehicles were arriving. Daniel counted them through his scope. 12 SUVs now, more coming. They were committing serious resources. Getting quite an audience, Sarah observed nervously. Good. Daniel checked his range cards one final time. More they commit, more they lose when it all goes wrong. The technical team moved in next, just as he'd predicted. 4 men with electronic warfare equipment moving with military precision. They focused on the sensors they'd found, never suspecting the real system was buried much deeper. Watch their pattern, Daniel instructed. See how they move in teams of 2? Ex-military, probably Mexican special forces. Good training, but wrong experience. They're used to fighting cartels and insurgents, never faced a prepared defensive position with interlocking fields of fire. Sarah studied the tactical map, finally understanding its brilliance. Every apparent weakness was a trap. Every obvious approach channeled attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. How long did it take you to set this up? 60 years, Daniel replied, checking his ammunition one final time. Every fence post, every building, every trail, all part of the plan. Your grandmother used to say I was obsessed with sight lines and fields of fire. She was right. The cartel's main force was assembling now. Through his scope, Daniel counted 50 men, heavily armed. They were taking no chances after yesterday's humiliation. They think numbers will make the difference, he said softly. Same mistake the Chinese made at Chosen. They never understand. That position and preparation multiply force. Sarah watched him make final adjustments to his equipment, his hands rock steady despite his age. The frail old man was gone, replaced by something else, a warrior who'd spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. One thing about being old, Daniel said, chambering around with practiced ease. Gives you lots of time to plan, lots of time to prepare. They think they're attacking a ranch. They're really walking into 60 years of tactical planning. The sun disappeared completely, leaving the ranch in darkness. But through his scope, Daniel Cooper saw everything, every approach, every position, every angle, all measured, all prepared, all waiting. The trap was set. Now it was just a matter of letting them spring it themselves. The cartel made their move at midnight, exactly as Daniel had predicted. 50 men moving in practiced formation, using night vision gear and tactical communications. They thought they were prepared for anything. They were wrong. Watch this, Daniel whispered to Sarah, his voice carrying the calm of a master at work. Through her scope, she watched the lead team approach the first fence line. They moved well, checking for sensors, maintaining proper spacing. The first shot came without warning, a single crack that echoed across the ranch. One of the cartel's forward observers dropped silently, his night vision gear shattering. 812 yards, Daniel reported calmly, already adjusting his aim. Wind 3 knots from the northwest. Another shot, another observer down. 794 yards. The cartel forces froze, suddenly realizing their night vision advantage was being systematically eliminated. Each shot was precisely placed, not to kill, but to destroy their expensive equipment. Jesus, Sarah breathed, watching through her scope. You're shooting the gear off their heads? Harder than killing them, Daniel acknowledged, his next shot disabling another set of night vision goggles. But sends a better message. The cartel commanders were shouting now, trying to reorganize their men. They'd expected alarms, security, lights, maybe some wild shooting. Instead, they faced precision fire from multiple angles, each shot deliberate and devastating. They're splitting up, Sarah reported, watching groups break off to find cover. Exactly as planned. Daniel's smile was predatory. Watch their pattern. They'll try to flank, use their numbers, walking right into the secondary positions. The cartel forces moved exactly as he'd predicted, seeking cover behind the very obstacles Daniel had spent decades positioning. Each group found themselves naturally channeled into pre-sighted killing zones. Time to introduce them to the ghost, Daniel said softly. He began to move, his crutches silent on the prepared pathways between his firing positions. Each location was carefully chosen, allowing him to engage, then disappear before they could respond. A burst of automatic fire lit up the night as the cartel forces shot at his previous position. But Daniel was already gone, appearing like a specter at another angle. 2 more shots, 2 more men disabled. They're getting nervous, Sarah observed, hearing the edge of panic in the cartel commander's shouts. Fear multiplies in the dark, Daniel replied, his voice instructor calm despite the chaos. Especially when you can't see what's hunting you. The cartel's tactical discipline began to crack. Some men fired wildly at shadows, others bunched up, seeking safety in numbers, making themselves perfect targets for Daniel's practiced shooting. El Fantasma, one of them screamed. It's the ghost. Daniel's next shot took the leader's radio, cutting off his attempt to coordinate their efforts. Always take their communications first, he explained to Sarah. Force them to bunch up to pass orders. The cartel forces tried to advance in teams, but each movement was met with precise fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Daniel's decades of preparation showed in every shot, every movement. Counting rounds, he quizzed Sarah, just as he'd done with students years ago. 23 shots, 23 hits, she replied, amazed. Not one wasted round. Conservation of ammunition, he nodded. First rule of extended engagements. A cartel fighter made the mistake of using a flashlight. Daniel's shot extinguished it instantly. 732 yards, he reported calmly. Holding 1 minute right for wind. The cartel's attack was falling apart. What had started as a coordinated assault had devolved into chaos. Every position they took came under precise fire. Every movement was met with accurate shots from impossible. Engels, they're breaking, Sarah reported, watching groups of men retreat to their vehicles. Not yet, Daniel replied, moving to his next position. Still need to teach them the final lesson. His next series of shots disabled their vehicles systematically, radiators, engines, fuel lines. Each hit calculated to ensure they couldn't simply drive away from this lesson. Always leave one vehicle, he instructed, as if this were just another training session. Give them a way out, but make them work for it. The cartel forces were in full retreat now, abandoning equipment and wounded as they fled toward their remaining vehicle. Daniel let them go, his last shot shattering the vehicle's side mirror, a final reminder of his precision. 38 shots total, Sarah counted, amazed. 38 hits, no fatalities. Killing's easy, Daniel replied, already securing his equipment. Teaching a lesson that sticks, that's harder. They'll be back, but now they know. Now they understand what they're really facing. As the sound of the retreating vehicle faded, Sarah looked at her grandfather with new eyes. The frail old man was gone, replaced by something else, a legend made real, a ghost given form. The ghost of Korea, she whispered, finally understanding. His old nickname, Daniel smiled, checking his ammunition. Ghosts don't die, little one, they just get more patient. News spread through the valley like wildfire. 50 cartel gunmen routed by one old man with a rifle. By dawn, Daniel's driveway was filled with pickup trucks. Ranchers who'd been ready to sell suddenly found their courage, drawn to the story of a 90-year-old sniper who'd humbled the cartel. Tell us how to fight them, Bill Henderson demanded, his broken arm still in its cast. 24 ranchers crowded Daniel's porch, each with similar stories of intimidation and fear. Teach us what you know. Daniel studied them from his rocking chair, noting their newfound determination. Fighting's not just about guns, he began, his instructor's voice carrying across the gathering. It's about preparation, observation, making your ground work for you. Sarah watched from the doorway as her grandfather began teaching, just as he'd done for Marine snipers decades ago. He showed them how to mark distances, establish fields of fire, create natural choke points with everyday ranch equipment. They hit Martinez's place at dawn, Sheriff Hayes reported, arriving with fresh news. First time they failed. Someone had moved his hay bales to block their approach, gave him time to call for help. Wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Daniel's smile was subtle. Amazing what folks can learn about tactical positioning when they put their minds to it. The cartel's response was swift but confused. Their usual intimidation tactics faltered against a community that had lost its fear. When they burned Thompson's barn, 6 neighboring ranchers helped rebuild it in a day, the new structure mysteriously better positioned for observation of the main road. They're changing tactics, Sarah reported, reviewing her intelligence notes. The valley's nurse network had become an effective information-gathering system. Less direct confrontation, more subtle pressure. They're trying to cut off supplies, block access roads. Standard insurgency tactics. Daniel nodded, making notes in his range book. Means we're hurting them. They wouldn't shift strategies. if the old one was working. At the local diner, Daniel's stand had become legend. Ranchers spoke in hushed tones about precise shots in total darkness, about cartel fighters fleeing from an unseen sniper. Each telling grew more elaborate, but the core truth remained. One old Marine had shown them that the cartel wasn't invincible. "Got 3 more requests for your ranch security consultation," Sarah said, checking her phone. She'd become her grandfather's de facto operations manager, coordinating the valley's growing resistance. Anderson Miller and the Wilson Place. "Set up the meetings," Daniel replied, studying his tactical map. The valley was transforming, each ranch becoming a hardened position in an expanding network of defensive points. Time to teach them about interlocking fields of fire. The cartel's frustration showed in their increasingly erratic actions. Their usual calculated violence gave way to desperate shows of force. But each attempt to reassert control met with prepared resistance. When they tried to intimidate the feed store into refusing service to specific ranchers, they found every rancher in the valley placing bulk orders through different suppliers. "It's not just about fighting," Daniel explained to his impromptu class of ranchers. "It's about making them work for every inch, making them pay a price for every move." Local law enforcement found their backbone, supported by a community that no longer looked away. Sheriff Hayes started enforcing regulations that had been conveniently overlooked, targeting cartel-owned businesses with inspections and fines. "Got word from up north," Hayes told Daniel during his daily briefing. Their relationship had evolved, the sheriff finally understanding his role in a larger strategy. "They're pulling in reinforcements, professional gunmen, former military." "Good," Daniel replied, surprising him. "Means we're winning." They wouldn't escalate if they were in control. The valley's transformation was subtle but profound. Ranchers installed security cameras that shared feeds with neighbors. CB radio networks crackled with coded warnings about cartel movements. Every piece of farm equipment seemed to find its way to positions that just happened to provide excellent cover and clear lines of sight. "They'll come at us harder next time," Sarah worried, watching more cartel vehicles moving on distant roads. "Try to make an example." Daniel checked his rifle, the same calm precision he'd shown for 60 years. "Let them come. Every rancher in this valley now knows their land like I know mine. Every approach covered, every movement watched. The sun set on a changed community. The cartel had wanted to take the valley through fear. Instead, they'd awakened something else, a community united, trained by a legendary Marine sniper, ready to defend their home with the same patience and precision he'd shown them. "Grandfather," Sarah said softly, reviewing the day's intelligence reports. "I don't think they understand what they're really fighting anymore." Daniel's smile carried 6 decades of tactical wisdom. "They never do, little one, they never do." The cartel's leadership gathered in a luxurious ranch house they'd acquired 3 months earlier. Ramirez paced before a tactical map of the valley, his usual composure shattered by recent events. Around him, his top lieutenants watched nervously as he reviewed their mounting losses. "One old man," he spat, slamming his fist on the table. "One crippled old sniper has turned the entire valley against us. Our men refuse to go out at night. Local suppliers won't work with us, even our loyal. Properties are starting to question our control." Through his scope, Daniel watched this meeting from exactly 923 yards away, reading their lips as they argued strategy. Sarah recorded everything with a high-powered camera, building their intelligence file. "They're bringing in their elite kill. Team," Daniel translated for her, "Los Ejecutores, former Mexican Special Forces, 30 men specialized in counter-sniper operations. Can you handle that many professionals?" Daniel's smile was cold. "Already have their advanced team in my logbook. 2 men, ghillie suits, tried to set up an observation post yesterday. Currently sleeping off some tranquilizers in Sheriff Hayes's jail." The cartel's mistake wasn't in the reinforcements they were bringing. It wasn't even in their choice of tactical teams. Their fatal error was fundamental. They still thought they were fighting one old sniper. "They're setting up wrong," Daniel observed, watching them mark positions on their maps, planning for a single shooter, looking to isolate and eliminate. Haven't realized what they're really facing. Sarah studied the cartel's planning session through her camera. What are they really facing? A prepared community, 60 years of defensive preparation, and most importantly, Daniel adjusted his scope slightly. A tactical situation they've never trained for. The cartel's plan became clear as they moved markers on their map. They would deploy their elite team in counter-sniper positions, coordinate with local forces, for a massive show of force, and finally eliminate the old man who'd humbled them. "Classic counter-sniper operation," Daniel explained, making notes. "Would work perfectly against a single shooter, but they're not considering one vital factor." "What's that?" "I've spent 60 years teaching others everything I know." He nodded toward distant ranches where his students waited. "Every rancher in this valley now knows how to read terrain, establish fields of fire, coordinate defensive positions. They're preparing to fight one ghost, but they're about to face an army of them." The cartel's elite team arrived at sunset. Professional killers with top-grade equipment and years of experience. They moved like shadows, setting up their positions with practiced skill, but every movement was noted, every position marked by watchful eyes across the valley. "They're good," Daniel admitted, watching them deploy. "Problem is, they're fighting the last war, setting up to take down a single sniper using textbook counter-sniper tactics." Sarah monitored the CB radio frequencies they'd established. Coded. Messages flowed between ranches, each one reporting cartel movements, marking positions, coordinating their response. The valley had become a single defensive unit, guided by Daniel's decades of experience. Their first mistake was thinking fear. "Would work forever," Daniel said, making final adjustments to his range cards. "Their second was assuming they could isolate us, but their fatal mistake, that's coming now." Through his scope, he watched the cartel's elite team finish their preparations. They'd established excellent firing positions, set up interlocking. Fields of fire prepared perfect counter-sniper tactics. Everything by the book. They're ready for a sniper duel, Daniel explained. Ready for one old ghost to try to outshoot them. What they're not ready for, he keyed his radio, sending a coded signal across the valley, is 40 ranchers who've learned to fight like ghosts. As night fell, the cartel's forces prepared to execute their perfect plan against a single legendary sniper. They had no way of knowing they were actually surrounded by an entire community that had learned to fight, shoot, and coordinate with military precision. "Let them come," Daniel said softly, watching more cartel forces arrive. "Let them commit everything to the wrong battle. Sometimes the biggest mistake isn't in how you fight." Sarah finished his thought. "It's in not knowing what you're really fighting against." In the gathering darkness, the cartel's elite killers moved into their final positions, confident in their superior numbers and training. They were about to learn the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the deadliest force isn't the enemy you can see, but the one you never knew existed. The cartel's elite team struck at midnight, executing their perfect counter-sniper operation. Their night vision equipment was top grade, their tactical movements flawless. Los ejecutores moved like shadows through the darkness, confident they could outmaneuver one old sniper. The first shot that rang out wasn't from Daniel's position. It came from the Henderson Ranch, 3 miles away, range 812 yards. Bill Henderson's voice crackled over the secure radio, steady despite his broken arm. "Target neutralized. Night vision equipment only." Before the cartel team could react, another shot came from the Wilson property, then another from the Martinez Ranch. Precise fire from multiple angles, using exactly the same techniques Daniel had taught them. "They're boxed in," Sarah reported from the command center, monitoring the tactical display they'd created. Every escape route covered by at least three positions. Daniel watched through his scope as the cartel's perfect plan dissolved into chaos. Their elite killers found themselves caught in a web of interlocking fields of fire, each carefully planned shooting position becoming a trap. "Standard counter-sniper tactics don't work," he explained calmly, "when you're facing an entire community that thinks like snipers." The cartel commanders tried to adjust, ordering their men to find the shooters. But every movement exposed them to fire from new angles. Every attempt to flank a position revealed another hidden shooter. "Thompson Ranch reporting," the radio crackled. "Two targets attempting to flank east, switching to non-lethal rounds." Daniel's students followed his example precisely, disabling equipment, wounding when necessary, but avoiding fatalities. Each shot was calculated to teach rather than kill. "They're starting to understand," Daniel observed, watching the elite team's movements become increasingly desperate. "See how they're bunching up? Losing their tactical spacing." Los Ejecutores, famous for their discipline, began to crack. They'd trained to fight other cartel gunmen, rebels, even military units. But this was different. An entire valley that had been transformed into one massive sniper's nest. 8 shooters neutralized, Sarah counted, marking positions on their tactical display. All their night vision equipment disabled. They're basically blind out there. Daniel keyed his radio. Phase 2. Across the valley, ranch lights began switching on in a carefully choreographed sequence. The sudden illumination destroyed the cartel team's natural night vision, leaving them exposed and disoriented. Now it was Daniel's turn. His first shot rang out from an impossible angle, taking the elite team's commander's radio with surgical precision. His second shot disabled their backup communications. "Always take their command and control first," he narrated for Sarah, just as he'd done for countless Marine students. "Force them to fall back on training, then show them why their training won't save them." The cartel's elite killers tried to retreat in good order, maintaining their professional discipline. But every route they took had been pre-sighted, every fallback position already covered by multiple shooters. "Martinez Ranch," the radio crackled. 3 targets moving west into Kill Zone 4. "Acknowledged," Daniel replied. "Take their weapons, non-lethal shots only." The night erupted in a symphony of precision fire. Ranchers who'd once barely known which end of a rifle to hold now demonstrated the skills of trained marksmen. Every shot was deliberate, every target carefully selected. "They're breaking," Sarah reported, watching the tactical display. "Complete command structure collapse." Los Ejecutores, the cartel's legendary kill team, had been reduced to a scattered group of frightened men, trying to escape a valley that seemed to have come alive with ghostly precision fire. "Final phase," Daniel commanded. Across the valley, his students implemented their last lesson. Careful shots disabled the cartel's vehicles, forcing their elite team to escape on foot through pre-sighted withdrawal routes. "Let them go," Daniel instructed, as his students reported clear shots on the fleeing men. "They'll carry the message, better than any bodies would." In the end, the cartel's elite team fled the valley in complete disorder. 30 professional killers, routed by what appeared to be phantom snipers, materializing from every shadow. Sarah reviewed the final tally. 47 disabled weapons, 28 pieces of night vision equipment destroyed, 17 minor injuries, no fatalities. Perfect execution of Daniel's tactical doctrine. "You didn't just teach them to shoot," she realized, watching the last cartel members flee. "You taught them to think like you, to fight like ghosts." Daniel smiled, his rifle still. "Trained on the retreat. Legends never die, little one. They just teach others how to become legends themselves." As dawn approached, the valley settled into an eerie quiet. The cartel's elite team had come expecting to face one legendary sniper. Instead, they'd discovered that Daniel Cooper's greatest weapon wasn't his rifle or his skill. It was his ability to turn an entire community into an army of ghosts. Ramirez returned 3 days later with everything he had. Sarah counted them through her scope: 15 vehicles, over 70 men, heavy weapons mounted on trucks. They'd abandoned subtlety for overwhelming force. "They're desperate now," Daniel observed from his command position, "making mistakes already. Look how they're clustering their vehicles. Poor tactical dispersal." The cartel's final assault force spread across the valley's entrance like a small army. They had belt-fed machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, even makeshift armored vehicles, everything they could muster for one final push. "All stations, report," Daniel commanded over their secure network. The responses came back quickly, every ranch in position, every sector covered. His students had learned well. Ramirez's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Cooper! You've had your fun, old man, but this ends today. No more games, no more tricks. Surrender now, or we burn everything." Daniel keyed his radio. "Remember your training. Let them commit fully before we respond. Wait for my signal." The cartel forces began their advance, moving in what they thought was an overwhelming display of force. Heavy weapons opened up, spraying Daniel's ranch with suppressing fire. They expected resistance from the main house. They were wrong. "Henderson Ranch," Daniel called. "Status?" 800 yards, clear shot on their heavy weapons team. "Martinez position?" "Coverage on their left flank, waiting your order." "Wilson team?" "Right flank secured. They haven't spotted our position." Daniel watched through his scope as the cartel forces pushed forward, their confidence growing with each unopposed step. They thought their heavy firepower had pinned down the defenders. Instead, they were walking into the most carefully prepared killing ground in Texas. "Now," Daniel commanded softly. The valley erupted, not from one position, but from dozens. Every ranch, every elevated position, every concealed bunker opened up simultaneously. The cartel forces found themselves caught in interlocking fields of fire from all directions. "Like Chosen all over again," Daniel murmured, his own rifle adding to the symphony of precision fire. "Except this time, I've got help." The cartel's heavy weapons were the first to go. Precise shots disabled their machine guns and rocket launchers. Their armored vehicles found themselves stuck in predetermined kill zones, unable to advance or retreat. "They're trying to flank west," Sarah reported, monitoring their tactical display. "Into the Anderson sector," Daniel nodded. "Just as planned." The flanking force ran straight into prepared positions. The Anderson family, 3 generations of ranchers who'd spent weeks training under Daniel's guidance, executed a perfect crossfire. Within minutes, 15 cartel gunmen found themselves pinned down, their weapons disabled by precise fire. Ramirez was screaming orders, trying to rally his men, but every command he gave played into Daniel's preparation, every movement exposed. His forces to fire from multiple angles. "Target their command vehicles," Daniel instructed. "Standard protocol. Communications first, then mobility." Across the valley, rifles cracked in disciplined volleys. The cartel's command and control structure began to disintegrate. Their radio communications went silent. Their vehicles, hit in radiators and engine blocks, became useless barriers. "Cooper!" Ramirez's voice carried a note of desperation now. "What are you?" Daniel's response came as a single shot that knocked the loudspeaker from Ramirez's hands. "I'm what happens when you push good people too far." The cartel forces began to break. What had started as an overwhelming assault had turned into a desperate scramble for survival. Every escape route they tried had been pre-sighted. Every rally point became another trap. "They're running," Sarah reported, watching groups of cartel. Gunmen abandoned their vehicles. "Let them," Daniel commanded, "but ensure they leave through our chosen routes." Precise fire herded the retreating forces down specific paths, each one designed to demonstrate the valley's complete defensive coverage. By the time they reached the highway, Ramirez's army had been reduced to a scattered band of frightened men. "Final count!" Sarah called out as the last vehicles fled. 32 vehicles disabled, 68 weapons destroyed, minor injuries only, no fatalities. Daniel lowered his rifle, surveying the battlefield through his scope one last time. The valley floor was littered with abandoned equipment and disabled vehicles, testament to the precise fire of his improvised army. "Not bad," he said softly, "for a bunch of ranchers and one old sniper." The sun rose over a changed valley. The cartel's attempt to take it by force had failed, not against one legendary marksman, but against an entire community he'd trained to fight like ghosts. "Think they'll be back?" Sarah asked, helping her grandfather pack away his equipment. Daniel smiled, the same cold smile that had once haunted Chinese commanders at Chosin. "No, little one. Some lessons only need to be taught once." The valley looked different the next morning. Disabled cartel vehicles dotted the landscape like strange metal sculptures, testament to the precision of the community's defense. Ranchers gathered at Daniel's property, not to seek protection this time, but to celebrate their victory. "Never seen anything like it," Sheriff Hayes said, surveying the aftermath. 70 armed cartel members routed without a single fatality. FBI's having trouble believing the report. Daniel sat on his porch, cleaning his rifle with the same methodical care he'd shown for 60 years. "Killing's easy," he replied, checking. "The bore, teaching a lesson that sticks, that's harder." The evidence of the battle was everywhere. Bullet-marked vehicles, disabled weapons, even abandoned body armor, all precisely damaged in ways that spoke of incredible marksmanship. Federal agencies had descended on the valley, drawn by reports of what seemed impossible. "They're calling it the Ghost Valley Incident," Sarah reported, showing her grandfather the news headlines on her phone. "Cartel forces defeated by unknown defenders. Nobody can explain how a bunch of ranchers fought off professional killers." Daniel smiled, watching his students gather around the property. Bill Henderson was teaching others how he'd set up his shooting position. Martinez was explaining his family's defensive arrangements. The valley had transformed from victims into warriors, each in their own way. "You know what really won this fight?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the gathering. "Not the shooting, not the tactics. It was them, regular folk standing together, refusing to be afraid anymore." The cartel's abandoned equipment told the story of their defeat. Night vision, gear, tactical radios, heavy weapons, all neutralized with surgical precision. But more telling were the tracks of their retreat, showing how they'd been systematically herded through pre-planned routes. "FBI wants to know how we coordinated such a complex defense," Hayes mentioned. "Told them it was just neighbors helping neighbors." "Best kind of victory," Daniel agreed. "One where the enemy never fully understands how they lost." Throughout the day, more stories emerged. How the Thompson family had disabled 3 cartel vehicles without ever being spotted. How the Martinez ranch had become a perfect firing position, covering approaches the cartel never thought to check, each tale adding to the valley's growing legend. "They're already calling you the Ghost Maker," Sarah told her grandfather. "Say you turned ordinary ranchers into invisible defenders." Daniel shook his head. "Didn't turn them into anything. Just showed them what they already were. Folks willing to stand up for their homes, their neighbors, their way of life." As sunset approached, the gathering took on a deeper meaning. Ranchers who'd once lived in fear now stood tall, proud of what they'd accomplished. Children played freely again, no longer kept indoors by worried parents. The valley had found its strength. "Got word from my contacts," Hayes reported quietly. "Cartels pulling out completely. Not just here, they're abandoning operations in 3 counties. Say the territory's not worth the cost." "Ghost Valley," Daniel mused, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of red and gold. "Good name for Place where regular folks learn to fight like shadows. Sarah sat beside her grandfather, noting how he still scanned the horizon out of habit. Think they'll ever know about all the preparation, the decades of planning? Better if they don't, Daniel replied. Sometimes the best defense is the one they can't quite figure out. Let them wonder. Let them tell stories about the valley where their best fighters were defeated by farmers and ranchers. The sunset painted long shadows across the battlefield of their victory, but these shadows no longer brought fear. Instead, they reminded everyone of how they'd learned to use darkness as an ally, terrain as a weapon, patience as armor. You did more than save the valley, Sarah said softly. You woke something up in these people, something that was always there, just waiting for someone to show them how to use it. Daniel nodded, watching his community celebrate their freedom. That's what the cartel never understood. They thought they were fighting one old sniper. Never realized they were really fighting the spirit of every person who ever stood up against bullies and said no more. As darkness fell, the valley settled into a peace it hadn't known in months. But it was a different kind of peace. Not the peace of submission, but the peace of strength, the peace of a community that had learned it could defend itself. Ghost Valley, Daniel repeated, smiling as the first stars appeared, has a nice ring to it. A month after the battle, Sarah found her grandfather in his barn, carefully organizing his tactical notes into leather-bound volumes. Each book contained decades of observations, range calculations, and defensive plans, a lifetime of preparation, distilled into written form, making sure it's all preserved, Daniel explained, labeling another volume. Knowledge paid for in blood shouldn't be lost. The valley had changed in subtle but profound ways. Regular shooting practices had become community events. Ranchers maintained their defensive positions as naturally as they maintained their fences. Children learned range estimation alongside riding and roping. The Martinez boy spotted cartel. Scouts yesterday, Sarah reported, helping him organize the books. They turned around as soon as they realized they were being watched, didn't even try to approach. Daniel nodded approvingly. Valley's got a reputation now. Sometimes the best fights are the ones you never have to fight. The FBI had finally closed their investigation, unable to explain how 70 professional gunmen had been defeated without a single fatality. Their report mentioned unusual tactical coordination among local residents and unexplained defensive capabilities. They're still trying to figure it out, Sarah said, showing him the final report. How ordinary ranchers fought like special forces. How farmers made professional killers retreat in panic. Let them wonder, Daniel replied, carefully copying range cards into a fresh notebook. Mystery's a better deterrent than any weapon. The community's transformation went deeper than just security. Neighbors who'd once lived in isolation now coordinated naturally, watching each other's properties, sharing information, maintaining the defensive network Daniel had taught them to create. Henderson's daughter won the state shooting championship, Sarah mentioned, said she learned more from you in a month than from years of competitive training. Daniel smiled, remembering the young girl's determination to master the skills he'd taught. She understood the most important lesson: patience. Same patience that lets you wait for the perfect shot, lets you stand up to threats without fear. As they worked, Sarah found photographs she'd never seen before. Her grandfather in Korea, young and fierce, teaching other Marines his skills. More recent images showed him training snipers in secret locations, passing on knowledge that had saved countless lives. You've been teaching all your life, she realized. The ranch, the defensive preparations, it was all just an extension of that, wasn't it? Teaching's the only true immortality, Daniel agreed. Skills pass on, multiply. Every person who learns becomes a teacher themselves. That's how legends stay alive. The valley's story had spread, growing with each telling. Other communities reached out, seeking advice on defending against criminal encroachment. Daniel's methods, patience, preparation, coordination, became a model for rural defense. Got another request, Sarah said, checking her messages. Small town in Arizona, cartel problems. They want to know how we did it. Daniel handed her one of his completed volumes. Send them this. Tell them it's not about the shooting. It's about the waiting, the watching, the willingness to spend years preparing for one crucial moment. As evening approached, they heard vehicles approaching, more ranchers arriving for their regular training session. The sound no longer brought tension, only purpose. The valley had learned to turn vigilance into a way of life. Your grandmother would be proud, Sarah said softly, watching the community gather. She always said you had a greater purpose here. Daniel nodded, touching the wedding ring he still wore. Margaret understood. Said God puts warriors in unexpected places for a reason. Sometimes the best place to make a stand isn't on a battlefield, it's right where you live. The legacy of Ghost Valley wasn't just in its successful defense. It was in the transformation of ordinary people into extraordinary protectors, in the way ranchers now taught their children both cattle breeding and tactical awareness, in how a community had learned to stand together against any threat. You didn't just teach us to shoot, Sarah realized, helping her grandfather gather his teaching materials. You taught us to be guardians, to protect not just our land, but our way of life. Daniel smiled, watching his students prepare for another lesson. That's the real victory, little one. Not defeating the cartel, but creating something they can never defeat, a community that knows how to defend itself generation after generation. The sun began to set on Ghost Valley, where an old Marine's lifetime of knowledge had transformed a vulnerable community into an unconquerable one. Not through force of arms, but through the patient teaching of a warrior who understood that the greatest battles are won in the preparation, not the fighting. 1 year after the Ghost Valley incident, Daniel Cooper sat on his porch in the golden light of a Texas sunset. His rifle rested across his lap, not for defense anymore, but for his daily maintenance ritual. Some habits never die, especially good ones. Movement on the South Road, Sarah called from inside, but there was no tension in her voice now. Through his scope, Daniel watched a familiar parade, local ranchers returning from their patrol rotation, keeping watch over the valley they'd learned to protect. 3 more cartels tried to move in last month, Sheriff Hayes reported, settling into the chair next to Daniel. All of them turned around at the county line. Your valley's got quite a reputation now. Not my valley, Daniel corrected, cleaning his rifle with practiced precision. Their valley. They're the ones who learned to defend it. The changes were subtle but permanent. Every ranch maintained its defensive positions as naturally as its cattle. Children learned range estimation alongside their ABCs. The community's coordination, born in crisis, had become a way of life. Got another letter, Sarah said, bringing out the evening mail. Department of Defense. They want to study the Ghost Valley defense model for rural security training. Daniel smiled, remembering other military studies he'd been part of. Tell them the same thing we tell everyone. It's not about the tactics, it's about the people. Community that stands together can't be defeated. The evening brought more visitors, students of what locals now called the Cooper method. Bill Henderson's daughter, fresh from winning national shooting championships. Jose Martinez's boys, who'd turned their ranch into a model of defensive positioning. Each one carrying forward what they'd learned. You know what the cartels call this place now? Hayes asked, watching the training session unfold. El Valle de los Fantasmas, the Valley of Ghosts. Say it's cursed, that old spirits protect it. Better than any fence, Daniel agreed. Fear of the unknown keeps more people honest than any weapon. Sarah joined them, her medical bag still slung over her shoulder from her rounds. She'd added tactical medicine to her nursing skills, teaching others how to handle emergencies under pressure. Another layer of the valley's self-sufficiency. "Thompson's setting up a shooting school," she reported. "Says there's too much demand to handle informally anymore. Wants to know if you'll consult." Daniel watched the sun paint the hills in shades of gold, remembering other times, other students. Might do that. Teaching's always been the best part of living. The valley had found more than just security. It had discovered a sense of purpose, a way of life that balanced readiness with peace. The defensive network Daniel had spent decades creating now belonged to everyone, maintained by the whole community. "Your grandmother once told me," Daniel said softly, "that sometimes God leaves old warriors around to teach others why we fight. Not for glory or revenge, but to protect what matters, to stand up for what's right." A lone coyote called in the distance, its voice carrying across land that would never again know fear. The valley had changed, but so had its people. They'd learned that strength doesn't come from weapons or tactics, but from unity and purpose. "You did more than save the valley, Grandpa," Sarah said, watching the training session below. "You woke something up in these people, something that was always there, just waiting for someone to show them how to use it." Daniel nodded, his aged hand still steady on his rifle. "That's the real victory, not beating the cartels, but creating something that will outlast us all. A community that knows how to stand together, that remembers what it means to be free." As darkness settled over Ghost Valley, lights winked on across the ranches, each one a signal, a reminder, a message to any who might think of bringing trouble. This land was protected not by one legendary sniper anymore, but by an entire community that had learned to fight like ghosts. "Peace at last," Daniel murmured, watching the stars emerge. "Real peace. Not the peace of submission, but the peace of strength." Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding finally complete. Her grandfather hadn't just been preparing for a battle all these years. He'd been preparing to pass on something more valuable than any tactical skill, the knowledge that ordinary people, standing together, could become extraordinary. The legend of Ghost Valley would grow, spreading to other communities facing similar threats, but the real story wasn't in the tactics or the training. It was in how one old warrior had taught an entire community that the strongest defense isn't in weapons or walls, but in the unshakable unity of people who've learned to protect their own. Daniel Cooper, the ghost of Korea, had fought his last battle, but his legacy would live on in every rancher who watched the horizon, every child who learned to gauge distance, every community that stood up and said no more to those who would rule through fear. The peace that settled over Ghost Valley was his true victory, not a peace enforced by strength of arms, but a peace protected by strength of community. And that, more than any battle won or enemy defeated, was worth every moment of his 90 years.